Welcome, seekers of wisdom and truth, to our journey into one of the most mysterious and captivating places of the ancient world, the Oracle of Delphi. For centuries, high atop the slopes of Mount Parnassus in Greece, pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean to ask the gods their most urgent questions. Here, in the Temple of Apollo, a priestess known as the Pythia would enter a trance, speaking cryptic words believed to be the voice of the divine. Her pronouncements shaped the fate of kings, guided armies, and influenced the rise and fall of entire civilizations. In this documentary, we will travel through time, from the earliest myths of the site to its final days under Rome. We will meet the figures who came seeking prophecy, uncover the rituals and beliefs behind the oracle's powers, and step into a world where the boundary between mortal and divine seemed to blur. Each chapter will draw you deeper into the secrets of Delphi, combining history, legend, and archaeological insight. So prepare yourself. Our path leads into the heart of ancient Greece, where every question comes at a price, and every answer hides a deeper meaning. High above the fertile plains of Phocis, where the olive groves glimmer in the sun, and the air carries the sharp scent of time, rises Mount Parnassus, a jagged titan of rock crowned in snow. To the ancient Greeks, this was no mere mountain. It was a dwelling of the gods, a sacred place where the mortal world touched the divine. Its towering cliffs caught the first golden rays of dawn, casting long shadows across the valley, and its peaks seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. Nestled on its slopes, between rugged crags and the singing waters of the Castalian spring, lay the sanctuary of Delphi. Here, legend said, Zeus himself had sent two eagles from opposite ends of the world. They met above this spot, marking it as the Omphalos, the navel of the earth. For the Greeks, this was the center of the world, a place where fate itself could be read. Travelers approached from dusty roads, winding through pine forests. Merchants, farmers, kings, and envoys from distant lands all came to Delphus' marble terraces. From a distance, the sanctuary appeared like a glittering crown upon the mountain's brow. White columns gleamed in the sunlight, and the great temple of Apollo, with its triangular pediment carved with divine scenes, seemed to guard the mysteries within. But Delphi was more than stone and legend. It was alive with the murmur of prayers, the clink of offerings, and the anticipation of prophecy. The people believed the god Apollo spoke here through his chosen mouthpiece, the Pythia. They came to learn their destinies, to seek divine counsel in times of war and peace. The mountain itself played a role in the oracle's magic. The ancients believed its slopes hid a cleft from which holy vapors rose. There's intoxicating and empowering the Pythia to speak with the voice of the god. Even the wind, sighing through Parnassus peaks, was thought to carry Apollo's whisper. Yet Parnassus was not only Apollo's realm, it was also sacred to the Muses, goddesses of inspiration. Poets and musicians claimed that their songs were born here, on the sunlit meadows and in the shaded glens. To stand on its slopes was to feel the pull of both wisdom and art, as if the mountain itself were a living bridge between reason and beauty. For those arriving at Delphi, the journey was both physical and spiritual. The climb tested the body, the temple tested the soul, and at the heart of it all was the belief that here, on this sacred mountain, the will of the gods could be heard, and perhaps, if one was worthy, understood. Mount Parnassus stood eternal, its stones weathered by centuries, yet its presence unchanged. It was not merely the backdrop for Delphi's story, it was the very stage on which the drama of prophecy and fate would unfold. Long before the marble columns of the Temple of Apollo rose on Mount Parnassus, Delphi was already a place of deep, ancient power. In the earliest days, before the light of Apollo shone upon it. This land was said to be guarded by a fearsome creature, the serpent dragon Python. Born of the earth itself, Python was a child of Gaia, the primordial mother goddess. It dwelt in a dark cavern near the Castalian spring, coiled in eternal watch over the sacred ground. In those days, Delphi was known not as Apollo's sanctuary, but as a place of chthonic worship where the earth's raw energies seeped from the ground. The priestesses served Gaia, whispering prophecies shaped by the deep powers of the underworld. Yet change was coming. From the far north, Apollo, the bright god of the sun, music, and prophecy, journeyed to claim a sacred seat for his oracle. Upon reaching Parnassus, he beheld Python, guardian and jailer of Delphus mysteries. In a clash that shook the mountain, Apollo loosed a volley of golden arrows from his silver bow. The air sang with divine music as his shots struck true, and the monstrous serpent writhed in its death throes. Yet even gods must obey the laws of the cosmos. By killing Python, a sacred guardian of Gaia, Apollo had committed sacrilege. To atone for the blood of the earth's child, he journeyed to the Vale of Tempe. He journeyed water, Bide, where he purified himself in the waters of the river Peneus. There he served as a humble herdsman for 9 years, an eternity for a god, until his penance was complete. When he returned, the sanctuary was his. He built his temple upon the sacred site, marking it as a place where his voice would reach mortals through the Pythia. But Apollo's victory did not erase Python's presence. The legend said that even in death, the spirit of the serpent lingered beneath the ground, its breath rising in vapors that inspired the Pythia's trances. This myth was more than a story. It was a symbol. It told of the transformation of Delphi from an ancient earth cult into a shining beacon of Apollo's light. It was the merging of the chthonic and the celestial, the old and the new, Earth's wisdom and the sun's clarity. From that day forward, the oracle's words were spoken in Apollo's name. Pilgrims believed that through the Pythia, they heard not only the god's will, but the ancient voice of the earth itself, tempered by the harmony of light. Delphi had become a bridge between worlds, between shadow and brilliance, mystery and reason. With Apollo's temple newly built upon the sacred slopes of Mount Parnassus, there remained one final step to make his sanctuary complete: the selection of a mortal mouthpiece. The god would not speak directly to humankind. His voice was too radiant, too overwhelming for any human ear to bear. Instead, his wisdom would flow through a chosen intermediary, the Pythia. The stories tell of a young woman from a nearby village, pure of spirit and untainted by the world's corruption. She came to the temple one crisp autumn morning, drawn by a calling she could not explain. Her name has been lost to history, yet the Greeks remembered her simply as the first Pythia, the vessel through which the god's voice first reached mortal ears. Before she could serve, she underwent sacred preparation. She bathed in the icy waters of the Castalian spring, believed to cleanse both body and soul. She chewed on laurel leaves, Apollo's sacred plant, and inhaled their bitter, aromatic scent. Clothed in flowing robes of white and gold, she was led into the temple's inner chamber, the adyton, where only she and the priests might tread. At the heart of the adyton, the omphalos stone rested, carved with intricate patterns and wrapped in woolen cords. Nearby, a chasm in the earth released a faint, sweet, scented vapor. As the Pythia seated herself upon a bronze tripod over the fissure, the air shimmered with heat and the scent grew stronger. She closed her eyes. Those present said her breathing deepened. Her voice began to murmur in strange, musical tones, and her body swayed gently as though to an unseen rhythm. The priests leaned close, listening, their trained ears catching fragments of prophecy. From the girl's lips came words not her own, phrases tangled in metaphor and mystery, yet filled with divine power. When the trance faded, the Pythia opened her eyes, unaware of the exact words she had spoken. The priests recorded her up, shaping them into the carefully measured hexameter verses that would be delivered to the waiting petitioner. Her first prophecy, so legend says, foretold the rise of a humble shepherd to kingship, a prediction that would come to pass within the year. News of the god's voice spread swiftly across Greece, and soon pilgrims from distant lands began their ascent to Delphi. Thus began a tradition that would last for nearly 1,000 years. The first Pythia's voice became the template for all who followed, a mortal chosen to channel the divine, a bridge between the light of Apollo and the questioning hearts of humankind. 2. In her time, she was not only revered but feared, for those who sought her counsel understood that to hear the will of the gods was to place oneself in the hands of destiny. And destiny was not always kind. Delphi was not simply a temple on a mountain. It was a sacred landscape, carefully shaped by nature and sanctified by myth. Every stone, spring, and pathway held meaning. To step into Delphi was to walk within a living map of the divine. The sanctuary lay high on the southern slopes of Mount Parnassus, its terraces carved into the rock to hold the temples, treasuries, and pathways. Upon arrival, pilgrims first encountered the sacred way, a winding marble path lined with statues, monuments, and offerings from cities across the Greek world. These gifts, gleaming bronze tripods, golden shields, and life-sized statues, were tokens of gratitude for Apollo's guidance or pleas for his favor. At the base of the sanctuary flowed the Castalian spring. Fed by mountain waters, it was more than a source of refreshment. It was a ritual necessity. Every pilgrim, priest, and Pythia bathed or drank here before entering the sacred precinct, for purity was required to approach the god. The spring itself was framed by stone basins, with channels directing its crystal waters, and myths told that the muses themselves had bathed here to gain inspiration. From the spring, the sacred way climbed upward, each turn revealing glimpses of the temple of Apollo, its white columns framed by the rugged cliffs above. These cliffs, known as the Phaedriads or Shining Ones, caught the sunlight in such a way that they glowed gold at midday, a sight that must have awed every visitor. At the heart of the sanctuary stood the omphalos, the navel stone of the world, smooth and rounded, carved with a net-like pattern, and adorned with sacred woolen fillets. It was the symbolic center of the earth. Here, Zeus' eagles were said to have met in their legendary flight from the ends of the world. To the Greeks, standing before the omphalos meant standing at the cosmic axis, a place where the divine and mortal realms converged. Surrounding the temple were treasuries, small but ornate buildings built by various city-states to store offerings and display their wealth. Each was an act of devotion but also a declaration of prestige, for even in piety there was rivalry. Beyond Apollo's temple lay another important shrine, the Tholos of Athena Pronaia. Circular in form, with graceful Doric columns, it marked the gateway to Delphi and served as a guardian sanctuary. Pilgrims often paid homage here before climbing to Apollo's domain. The very arrangement of Delphi's sacred spaces seemed designed to prepare the mind for prophecy. The path was not straight. It curved and rose, forcing the visitor to journey both physically and spiritually before reaching the god. By the time they stood before the Pythia, the pilgrim had walked through myth, beauty and divine symbolism, their hearts ready to receive Apollo's word. In Delphi, geography was not an accident of nature. It was the architecture of belief. The road to Delphi was more than a path of stone and dust. It was a rite of passage. For the pilgrim, each step carried not only the weight of travel, but the weight of expectation. Our traveler begins at dawn, setting out from a distant village in Boeotia. The autumn air is crisp, the mountains etched in gold by the rising sun. He carries with him a small bundle, a clay figurine of Apollo as an offering, a pouch of coins, and a heart heavy with questions. His journey is not one of curiosity alone. He seeks an answer that will shape the course of his life. The road winds through olive groves, the silvery leaves whispering in the breeze. Herds of goats cross the path, their bells tinkling like distant chimes. He joins a group of fellow travelers, merchants from Corinth, a Spartan soldier on leave, and a woman from Thessaly whose brother vanished in war. They share food, stories, and silence as the road climbs higher. By midday, the group reaches the lower slopes of Mount Parnassus. The terrain becomes steeper, the air cooler. In the distance, the cliffs of the Phaedriades glow as if lit from within. The travelers pause, awed by the sight, for they have heard the tales. These shining cliffs are a sign that they are entering the realm of Apollo. The first ritual stop is the Castalian spring. Here, the pilgrim kneels beside the stone basin, splashing the icy water on his face. The chill bites, but he feels a clarity in his mind, as though some unseen burden has been lifted. He drinks deeply, believing that in doing so, he takes in a fragment of the mountain's sacred essence. From the spring, the sacred way ascends. The path curves, revealing statues of bronze warriors, marble lions, and golden tripods gifted by kings and city-states. The pilgrim's eyes linger on a tall column topped by a gleaming sphinx, a guardian of mysteries. Every turn feels like a step closer to the heart of the divine. At last, the Temple of Apollo comes into view, its columns standing proud against the mountain's flank, its pediment adorned with carvings of gods and muses. The air here feels different, charged with a quiet energy. The pilgrim approaches the temple steps, his offering clutched tightly in hand. A priest greets the group, inspecting their offerings and instructing them on the proper rites. They must each burn a small pinch of barley on the altar before entering. The smell of smoke mingles with mountain air, and the sound of a distant lyre drifts from within the temple. For the pilgrim, the journey has ended, but in truth, it has only just begun. The next step will take him into the presence of the Pythia, where his question will be answered, though perhaps not as he expects. The temple of Apollo stood at the heart of Delphi, like a jewel set into the mountain's crown. Its white marble columns gleamed under the sun, their fluted shafts rising toward the sky in a display of balance and strength. From the moment a pilgrim stepped onto its steps, the outside world seemed to fade, replaced by the weight of divine presence. The temple visible today was the third built on the site. The first had been of laurel wood, honoring Apollo's sacred tree. The second, of stone, fell to ruin after centuries of earthquakes and fire. The third, constructed in the 3rd century BCE, was a masterpiece of Doric architecture, funded by a league of Greek city-states determined to preserve Delphus' prestige. Approaching the entrance, pilgrims passed between two massive columns, supporting a triangular pediment. Carved within it were scenes from Apollo's life, the god riding his chariot across the sky, his lyre in hand, the slaying of Python, and the muses dancing in eternal harmony. Within the pronaos, or forecourt, inscriptions lined the walls, and These were the Delphic maxims, short phrases such as "know thyself" and "nothing in excess." Every visitor, whether king or commoner, was reminded that wisdom lay not in power or wealth, but in self-understanding and moderation. Beyond this was the cellars, the main chamber. Here, a colossal cult statue of Apollo stood, carved from gleaming marble, his gaze serene yet commanding. Gold leaf adorned his hair, and in his hand rested a laurel branch, symbol of victory and prophecy. Oil lamps flickered in the dimness, casting dancing shadows across the walls. At the very heart of the temple, accessible only to the Pythia and the priests, lay the Adyton, the innermost sanctuary. Here the omphalos stone rested, and the fissure in the earth released its mysterious vapors. It was in this chamber, seated upon a bronze tripod, that the Pythia entered her trance and spoke Apollo's will. The temple was not silent. The faint sound of a lyre or flute often drifted through the halls, played by musicians in service to the god. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, frankincense and myrrh, mingling with the crisp mountain breeze that slipped in through open doorways. To the Greeks, the Temple of Apollo was more than a building. It was a gateway between mortal and divine realms. Every stone had been placed with reverence, every carving a prayer in marble. Those who stood within its columns did so in the presence of something greater than themselves, and they left changed, whether or not they fully understood the oracle's words. In its design, its symbols, and its atmosphere, the temple embodied the essence of Apollo: clarity, harmony, and the light of truth piercing the shadows of uncertainty long before the first pilgrim knelt before her tripod. The Pythia's journey into prophecy began with a sequence of sacred rites. These preparations were as essential as the prophecy itself, for without them, she could not safely become the voice of Apollo. At dawn, she rose in her quarters within the sanctuary, the air still cool with mountain mist. She was not an ordinary woman during these days. She was the chosen vessel of the god. Her body and mind had been prepared for weeks, fasting from certain foods, abstaining from contact with death or impurity, and spending time in prayer. The first step was purification. Guided by 2 attendants, the Pythia walked to the Castalian spring, a short distance from the temple. Here she bathed in the icy waters that flowed down from Mount Parnassus. The shock of the cold was believed to sharpen the senses and cleanse the spirit. She also drank from the spring, symbolically taking in Apollo's purity. Next came the laurel ritual. Laurel leaves, sacred to Apollo, were brought from the groves that surrounded the temple. The Pythia chewed a few leaves, their bitter taste filling her mouth, while holding a laurel branch in her hand. The priests believed this linked her directly to the god's essence, for the laurel was his emblem of victory and prophecy. She then dressed in ceremonial robes, a flowing white chiton bound with golden cords, symbolizing the light of the sun, and a veil that covered her head but left her face exposed. Gold earrings and bracelets completed her attire, marking her as one who served the highest divine power. Before entering the temple, the Pythia approached Apollo's altar, where she sprinkled barley grains and poured a libation of water from the Castalian spring. The priests chanted hymns, their deep voices echoing off the stone, calling upon Apollo to descend into his sanctuary. Inside, she moved to the Adyton, the inner chamber. A bronze tripod stood over a fissure in the earth, from which sweet-scented vapors rose. The omphalos stone, symbol of the earth's center, rested nearby, its carved patterns catching the dim light. The Pythia seated herself upon the tripod, laurel branch in one hand, a shallow bowl of spring water in the other. She closed her eyes and inhaled the vapors, letting her breath deepen. Soft music from a lyre played in the background as her mind slipped from the mortal realm into the divine. Her voice began to murmur, not yet prophecy, but the first ripples of the god's presence. Soon the priests would bring the petitioner forward, and the true words of Apollo would flow. But in this moment, she was suspended between worlds, ready to carry the light of the god into the hearts of mortals. The air inside the Adyton was heavy with incense, and the faint, sweet-scented vapors rising from the fissure in the earth. For the Pythia, this was the threshold between the mortal world and the divine, a place where the voice of Apollo could pierce the veil of human thought. Seated upon the bronze tripod, her bare feet resting on the warm stone floor, the Pythia clutched her laurel branch and a shallow bowl of water from the Castalian spring. The omphalos stone sat nearby, its carved patterns glistening faintly in the dim light. Priests moved quietly around her, tending the altar and chanting hymns that rose and fell like the rhythm of breathing. The vapors drifted upward, curling in the torchlight. They were believed to come from the earth's depths, perhaps the breath of the slain python, or the earth's own exhalation. Ancient sources spoke of their power to open the mind to visions, to loosen the boundaries of ordinary thought. The Pythia inhaled deeply. At first, her breathing was steady, her eyes half-lidded. Slowly, her body began to sway, her movements matching the cadence of the priest's chants. The laurel branch trembled slightly in her grasp. A change came over her voice. It dropped into a low, murmuring tone, as though she spoke to someone unseen. The words were strange, fragmented, flowing in a rhythm that was not her own. The priests leaned in, their ears trained to catch every syllable, scribes ready to record her utterances. Her speech quickened, rising and falling like waves on a restless sea. Her head tilted back, her eyes closed, yet her expression shifted as though reacting to visions unseen by others. The laurel leaves brushed against her cheek, their scent mingling with the vapors. Outside the Adyton, the petitioner waited in tense silence. The priests would soon bring them forward, but for now, the Pythia was entirely within Apollo's grasp. In this altered state, she was no longer herself. Her identity dissolved into the god's presence, her human voice carrying words shaped by divine will. Some witnesses described her trance as serene, her words flowing like music. Others claimed it was more intense, her voice rising into shouts, her body trembling, her face alight with something both beautiful and fearsome. However it manifested, all agreed that the Pythia was not speaking from her own mind. When the flow of words began to slow, the priests knew it was time. They signaled to the petitioner, who stepped forward into the dim chamber. Kneeling before her, they posed their question, their voice barely above a whisper. The Pythia's answer would be spoken in riddles and symbols, but within it, they believed, lay the truth of the gods. The vapors swirled. The voice of Apollo filled the room. The oracle had begun. The Pythia's trance was only the beginning of the oracle's work. While her voice carried the words of Apollo, it was the priests and interpreters who ensured those words reached the petitioner in a form they could understand, though never so clearly that all mystery was removed. Inside the temple of Apollo, 3 chief priests, known as the Hosioi or the Holy Ones, oversaw the process. They were men of long service and deep religious training, chosen for their knowledge of ritual, poetry, and the laws of the gods. Around them worked lesser attendants, scribes, musicians, and acolytes, each with a role in guiding the prophecy from divine inspiration to spoken decree. As the Pythia's voice rose in the Adyton, A scribe crouched nearby with a wax tablet, marking down her utterances as quickly as the stylus could scratch. The words often came in fragments, half-formed sentences, symbolic images, and repetitions. The Pythia spoke as if seeing visions, naming places, people, and omens without explanation. Once the trance ended, the priest stepped forward. They did not question the Pythia about her words. The divine message was not hers to explain. Instead, they gathered around the scribe's tablet, reading the raw phrases aloud. The air in the temple would still be thick with incense. The murmurs of the petitioner hushed in expectation. The chief interpreter, usually the most senior priest, began to shape the fragments into a coherent prophecy. The tradition was to frame Apollos' words in hexameter verse, relucing to ring the same meter used by Homer in the Iliad and Odyssey. This gave the prophecy a poetic, timeless quality, as if the god himself spoke in the language of epic heroes. The priests understood that clarity was not the goal. The oracle's reputation rested on ambiguity. A prophecy too plain could be proven wrong. A prophecy veiled in riddle could unfold in unexpected ways and still be true. Thus, "You will go, you will return, never in war will you perish" could be either a blessing or a warning, depending on where one placed the pause. When the verse was complete, the priest summoned the petitioner. Standing before the temple's altar, they recited the oracle with solemn gravity, their voices measured and resonant. The petitioner would bow, offering thanks and gifts, and depart to ponder the meaning. The priests never explained the prophecy outright. They believed the god's words were a mirror, reflecting each listener's own fate and choices. Interpretation was the burden of the seeker, not the giver. Outside, as the petitioner stepped back into the sunlight, the priests returned to their duties, preparing for the next inquirer, maintaining the sanctity of the temple, and guarding the centuries-old traditions that made Delphi not merely a place, but a living voice of the gods. At Delphi, no question could be asked without first honoring a complex web of customs and sacred rules. These protocols preserved the dignity of the oracle and ensured that Apollo's voice was sought with reverence rather than desperation. For the Greeks, the act of consulting the Pythia was not casual. It was a privilege earned through patience, preparation, and piety. In earlier centuries, the Pythia spoke only once a year, on the 7th day of the month of Bysios, believed to be Apollo's birthday. Later, due to the growing number of pilgrims, sessions were held once a month for 9 months of the year. Even so, the oracle was closed during the winter, when Apollo was said to leave Delphi and travel north to the land of the Hyperboreans. During those months, the god Dionysus presided over the sanctuary. On consultation days, the order of petitioners was determined by promentia, the right to consult the oracle before others. This right could be granted as a reward by the city of Delphi to allied states, honored individuals, or victorious athletes in the Pythian Games. For everyone else, the queue was long and uncertain. Before approaching the Pythia, each petitioner underwent ritual purification. They bathed in the Castalian spring, offered barley grains on the altar, and sacrificed a goat to Apollo. The goat was sprinkled with cold water. If it shivered, the sign was favorable, and the consultation could proceed. If it did not, the question could not be asked that day. The phrasing of the question itself was a matter of importance. The priests advised petitioners to be concise and respectful, framing their inquiry in a way that could be answered by the god without confusion. A poorly formed question might invite a misleading or obscure reply. Once the formalities were complete, the petitioner waited for the priests to call them forward. They entered the temple quietly, bowing before the altar and leaving their offering, often coins, precious objects, or finely crafted gifts, in Apollo's treasury. Only then were they brought into the presence of the Pythia, who was already seated in trance within the Adyton. The petitioner spoke their question clearly, often in a single breath, while the priests listened and relayed it to the Pythia if needed. Her answer, delivered in murmured, trance-filled speech, was recorded by scribes, shaped into verse by the priests, and finally recited aloud in the temple. Afterward, the petitioner departed with the prophecy, bound by custom to honor Apollo with further offerings. If the god's guidance brought success, the journey home was as contemplative as the journey to Delphi, for the meaning of the god's words often unfolded slowly, like a seed taking root in the mind. In Delphi, these rules were not obstacles, they were the sacred frame around a divine picture. To bypass them would be to diminish the power of the oracle itself. Delphi was not only a place for humble farmers or wandering merchants. Kings, generals, and tyrants traveled great distances to kneel before the Pythia, believing that Apollo's words could secure their reign or save their armies from destruction. The sanctuary's marble steps had felt the tread of rulers, whose names would be etched into history. Some uplifted by the oracle's guidance, others undone by its riddles. One of the most famous royal consultations came from Croesus, king of Lydia. Before waging war against the Persian Empire, Croesus sent envoys to oracles across the Greek world, testing them with the question, "What is King Croesus doing right now?" Only the Pythia answered correctly, describing in detail that he was boiling a lamb and a tortoise in a bronze cauldron. Convinced of her divine insight, Croesus returned to Delphi in person, bearing lavish gifts, golden bowls, ingots, and a lion statue. He asked if he should go to war. Should war? The oracle replied, "If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus took this as a blessing, but the prophecy's ambiguity proved fatal. The great empire destroyed was his own. In another era, the oracle counseled Lycurgus, lawgiver of Sparta. Seeking divine sanction for his reforms, Lycurgus was told that Apollo approved of his laws and that Sparta would flourish if they were followed. This gave his constitution unshakable legitimacy, shaping Spartan society for centuries. Not all leaders were welcomed. Tyrants who came with arrogance or threats were met with silence, or worse, a curse. The oracle's authority was so great that a single unfavorable prophecy could undermine a ruler's legitimacy in the eyes of his people. Stories tell of a petty despot who demanded the god predict his eternal rule, all for a morgue, only to receive the chilling response, "You will rule until a stronger man comes." Within a year, he was overthrown. The priests were careful when dealing with rulers. They knew the oracle's words could change the fate of nations. Yet they never strayed from their sacred role. Apollo's will was to be spoken without fear or flattery. A king might shower Delphi with treasure, but wealth could not buy a prophecy. Beyond Greece, even foreign rulers sought the oracle's wisdom. Pharaohs of Egypt sent emissaries, and distant kings from the east brought exotic gifts. For them, Delphi was not just a religious site, it was the most trusted political advisor in the ancient world. And yet, whether the seeker wore a crown or a beggar's cloak, the truth remained: the oracle gave guidance, not guarantees. Kings who forgot this often found that the god's riddles could crown them one year and cast them into ruin the next. War was one of the most frequent reasons rulers and generals came to Delphi. In the ancient Greek world, battles were never fought without the blessing or warning of the gods. The oracle of Apollo was seen as the highest authority in these matters, and her words could determine whether an army marched or stayed home, whether peace was sought or swords were drawn. One of the most famous military consultations occurred during the Persian Wars. In BCE, when Athens faced the invasion of Xerxes and his vast army, the Athenian envoys, trembling with urgency, came to Delphi seeking guidance. The Pythia's first prophecy was grim: flee to the ends of the earth. The Pythia's first prophecy: grim. All is lost. The head will not remain in place, nor the body, nor the feet, nor the hands, nor the parts between. Horrified, the envoys begged for a more hopeful answer. The Pythia then offered her second, equally enigmatic counsel: though all else shall be taken, a wooden wall shall not fall. The Athenians debated the meaning of the wooden wall. Some believed it referred to the old wooden fortifications around the Acropolis, but Themistocles, a brilliant general, argued that it meant their fleet of wooden ships. Acting on his interpretation, Athens evacuated its people and met the Persians at sea in the decisive Battle of Salamis, a victory that turned the tide of the war. Sparta, too, sought the oracle before the legendary Battle of Thermopylae. The Pythia told them that either a Spartan king would fall or the city itself would be destroyed. Leonidas, king of Sparta, took this as a call to sacrifice. With Samnite warriors and a handful of allies, he held the pass at Thermopylae against overwhelming Persian forces, dying in battle but fulfilling the prophecy. The oracle's influence on warfare was not limited to great alliances. Smaller city-states often sought her counsel in border disputes, pirate threats, or rebellions. A single phrase from Delphi could sway allies to join a cause, or convince them to withdraw support. There were also times when the oracle refused to give an answer, especially if the petitioner came in arrogance or sought to twist Apollo's words for personal gain. This silence was itself a kind of prophecy, a warning that the god would not bless a doomed or unjust war. To the warriors who stood before the Pythia, the marble columns of Apollo's temple seemed as solid as destiny itself. The smell of incense, the flicker of torchlight, and the solemn voice of the priests made every prophecy feel like a divine command. But the oracle never promised victory, only guidance. The outcome still depended on human courage, skill, and, perhaps, the favor of the gods. In the ancient world, setting out to found a new city was one of the most perilous and ambitious undertakings a community could attempt. A colony was more than an outpost. It was a new life in an unfamiliar land, far from the safety of home. Before any such venture began, it was common practice to seek the blessing and guidance of the Oracle of Delphi. Greek city-states often faced population pressure, famine, or political unrest. In such times, leaders decided to send groups of settlers overseas. The choice of where to go and how to survive there was not left to chance. Envoys traveled to Delphi to ask Apollo where their colony should be built. The Pythia's words could point to a fertile plain, a defensible harbor, or a distant coast rich in resources. One famous case was the founding of Cyrene in North Africa. The people of Thera, suffering from drought, sought the oracle's help. The Pythia commanded them to sail to the fertile land, where the Libyan plains meet the sea. At first, they resisted, uncertain about such a distant and dangerous voyage. But repeated consultations and worsening conditions at home finally convinced them to act. The colony they established would grow into a powerful city, renowned for its trade and culture. The oracle's guidance was not always straightforward. Sometimes she spoke in riddles, forcing the leaders to interpret the meaning themselves. A city might be told to follow the flight of the heron or seek the place where the sun rises twice. These clues could refer to landmarks, natural phenomena, or symbolic signs. Interpretation was both an art and a gamble. Explorers and traders also came to Delphi before embarking on dangerous journeys. Captains sailing into the Black Sea, an area rich in grain and trade but fraught with storms and hostile tribes, would ask the Pythia for protection and auspicious routes. Her approval was seen as a shield against misfortune, while a warning could halt an expedition entirely. The oracle's influence extended beyond Greek settlers. Foreign envoys sometimes arrived seeking advice on alliances, trade networks, or the founding of markets. In this way, Delphi became a hub of international diplomacy, its influence stretching across the Mediterranean and into lands as far as Egypt and the Levant. Colonization and exploration carried enormous risks, and not all ventures succeeded. But those launched with Apollo's blessing were believed to carry divine favor, even if hardships arose. A failed colony could be seen as the settlers' fault for misunderstanding. The gods will rather than a flaw in the prophecy itself. Through these acts of guidance, Delphi shaped the very map of the ancient world. New cities rose, trade routes flourished, and the culture of Greece spread far beyond its homeland, all under the watchful gaze of the god whose voice spoke from the heart of Mount Parnassus. The oracle of Delphi was not only a guide for kings and generals, it was also a place where seekers of truth came to wrestle with life's deepest questions. Among those seekers were some of the greatest minds in history, philosophers whose ideas would shape the foundations of Western thought. The most famous philosophical consultation came from Socrates. According to his student, the story began when Socrates' friend Chaerephon visited Delphi and asked the Pythia if there was anyone wiser than Socrates. The oracle replied, "No one is wiser." When Socrates heard this, he was puzzled. He claimed to know nothing, and thus could not be the wisest. But rather than dismiss the oracle, he sought to understand her meaning. He began questioning politicians, poets, and craftsmen, discovering that while they believed they knew much, their knowledge was flawed. In contrast, Socrates recognized the limits of his own understanding. Thus, the oracle's riddle was revealed. Wisdom lies in knowing that you do not know. Other philosophers reasons. Pythagoras, the mathematician and mystic, is said to have visited Delphi to learn about the harmony of the cosmos. He believed that the oracle's wisdom confirmed his theory that the universe was governed by numbers and proportion. The Stoics, centuries later, saw the oracle as a model of living in accordance with nature's order. They admired how her words were shaped not by personal desire, but by alignment with a higher law. To them, the Pythia was the living embodiment of the principle that one should accept what is fated and act in harmony with it. Yet philosophers were not uncritical. Some, like Xenophanes, warned against taking every prophecy at face value, arguing that the ambiguity of the oracle's language could lead to misinterpretation. This skepticism, however, did not diminish Delphi's prestige. If anything, it deepened the intellectual engagement with her words. Maze. For many thinkers, the pilgrimage to Delphi was as much symbolic as it was practical. The climb up Mount Parnassus represented the ascent of the mind toward higher understanding. The purification in the Castalian spring mirrored the cleansing of the intellect from falsehood. and the encounter with the Pythia was the moment when thought met mystery, where reason acknowledged the limits of human grasp and opened itself to the divine. Even after philosophy began to turn toward logic, science, and empirical proof, Delphi retained its place as a touchstone of wisdom, for in the Pythia's cryptic utterances, there was always a reminder that truth is not merely discovered, it is interpreted, lived, and sometimes humbly accepted as beyond our reach. The sacred way of Delphi was more than a winding path toward the Temple of Apollo. It was a dazzling gallery of wealth, pride, and devotion. Along its length stood small, elegant buildings known as treasuries, each constructed by a Greek city, state, or powerful ruler to house offerings to Apollo. These treasuries were both acts of piety and public statements of prestige, turning the sanctuary into a place where politics, religion, and art met in gleaming marble. Every treasury was unique, reflecting the style and wealth of its donors. They were not vaults in the modern sense, but miniature temples, richly decorated and built to last for centuries. Inside, they stored gold and silver vessels, bronze tripods, precious weapons, and artworks, gifts meant to honor the god and showcase the power of the city that offered them. One of the most famous was the treasury of the Athenians, built after their victory at the Battle of Marathon in Cebychosus BCE. Constructed entirely of Parian marble, its walls bore relief carvings of Theseus' heroic deeds and the exploits of Heracles. These images reminded visitors not only of Athens' military triumph, but also of its claim to heroic lineage. Nearby stood the treasury of the Siphnians, funded by the island's wealth from gold and silver mines. Unlike other treasuries, it was supported by two sculpted caryatids, female figures in place of columns. Its friezes depicted scenes of gods and heroes in vivid detail, from the Trojan War to the Judgment of Paris. To walk past it was to be confronted with a vivid tapestry of myth carved in stone. Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and other states each had their own treasuries, and their placement along the sacred way was no accident. A visitor approaching the Temple of Apollo would pass by these monuments in succession, absorbing the implicit message: the most powerful and devout cities in Greece had come here, honored Apollo, and been rewarded with his favor. The contents of these treasuries could be used in times of crisis. During wars or emergencies, city-states sometimes reclaimed their offerings, seeing them as both sacred gifts and a reserve of wealth. But such acts were rare and controversial, for removing a gift from Apollo's house risked divine displeasure. To the pilgrims climbing toward the temple, the treasuries were as awe-inspiring as the temple itself. The glint of gold through an open doorway, the scent of incense drifting from within, and the carved stories on the walls turned the journey into a procession through the shared memory of Greece. In this way, the treasuries of Delphi were more than repositories of wealth. They were shrines to human achievement, divine favor, and the unspoken competition between cities. Here, politics and piety were carved in marble, standing side by side. Beneath the gaze of the god, every 4 years, the sanctuary of Delphi came alive with the sound of music, the roar of crowds, and the clash of athletic competition. These were the Pythian Games, a festival held in honor of Apollo, second in prestige only to the Olympic Games. Unlike the Olympics, however, the Pythian Games were not solely about physical strength. They were a celebration of both athletic and artistic excellence, reflecting Apollo's dual role as god of sport and god of the arts. Kuchas. The origins of the games lay in myth. After slaying the serpent Python, Apollo was said to have instituted the festival to commemorate his victory. At first, the contests were purely musical, with poets, singers, and musicians competing to see who could most skillfully praise the god. Later, athletic events were added, making the Pythian Games a unique blend of body and spirit. The competitions were divided into two main categories: artistic and athletic. In the artistic contests, musicians played the kithara and the iulos, singers performed hymns to Apollo, and poets recited epic verses. These performances took place in Telephus Theatre, its stone seats carved into the slope of Mount Parnassus, with a view of the valley below. The music floated on the mountain air, a living offering to the god. The athletic contests mirrored those of other Panhellenic festivals. There were footresses of various lengths, wrestling, boxing, and pancration, a brutal blend of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules. Equestrian events were a highlight, with chariot races thundering across the hippodrome, dust rising in great clouds as the drivers urged their horses on. Victors in the Pythian Games did not receive gold or silver. Instead, they were crowned with a wreath of laurel, Apollo's sacred tree, cut from a grove in Tempe. This symbolized that their victory was a gift of the god, not merely a result of human effort. The laurel crown carried immense prestige. Its recipient was celebrated in their home city as one favored by Apollo himself. The festival also included grand processions and sacrifices. Delegations from city-states arrived in colorful robes, carrying banners and gifts for the god. Priests led sacrifices of bulls and goats, their smoke rising against the cliffs of the Phaedriades. Between events, pilgrims could visit the temple of Apollo, consult the oracle, or admire the treasuries along the sacred way. For a few glorious days, Delphi was the center of the Greek world. Merchants filled the streets with stalls, philosophers debated in the shade of olive trees, and poets composed verses in the hum of the crowd. When the festival ended, the valley fell silent again, but the laurel wreaths, songs, and victories of the Pythian Games would echo through memory until the next great gathering in the early 5th century BCE. The Greek world faced its gravest threat, the vast armies of the Persian Empire. The invasions of King Darius, and later his son Xerxes, brought fear to every city-state, and many turned to Delphi for guidance. In the struggle for survival, the oracle's words would echo through history, shaping some of the most decisive events of the Persian Wars. So in Cbibashas BCE, as Xerxes prepared to sweep into Greece with an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands, the Athenians sent envoys to Delphi. The Pythias' first prophecy was bleak, almost hopeless. "Oh, why sit you, doomed ones? Fly to the ends of the earth. All is ruin. Fire and swift Ares shall bring you low. The head will not remain in place, nor the body, nor the feet, nor the hands, nor the parts between. All is lost, shaken." The Athenians begged for a second prophecy. The Pythia relented, offering more cryptic hope. "Though all else shall be taken, a wooden wall shall not fall. Blessed Salamis, you shall cause the death of women's sons." The meaning of the wooden wall became the subject of fierce debate in Athens. Some thought it meant reinforcing the old wooden palisades of the Acropolis. Others, led by the general Themistocles, argued it referred to the fleet of wooden triremes. His interpretation prevailed, and Athens evacuated its population, while the navy prepared for battle. This decision led directly to the Battle of Salamis, where the Greek fleet dealt a crushing defeat to the Persians, fulfilling the prophecy in blood and victory. The Spartans, too, sought Apollo's counsel. Before the Battle of Thermopylae, the oracle told them, either your glorious city will be sacked by the sons of Perseus, or a king of the race of Heracles must perish. King Leonidas took the message as his fate. Leading a small force of Samnite Spartans and a few thousand allies, Elfricticderi, he held the narrow pass against overwhelming numbers. For 3 days, sacrificing himself to save the rest of Greece from immediate conquest. His death fulfilled the oracle's grim prediction and became a symbol of courage. Delphi itself was threatened during the invasion. When Persian troops approached, legend says that the priests refused to evacuate, trusting Apollo to defend his sanctuary. According to Herodotus, as the Persians neared the temple, thunder rolled, lightning struck, and great rocks tumbled from the slopes of Mount Parnassus, crushing the invaders. The survivors fled, convinced the god himself had intervened. Through these prophecies, the oracle did more than predict events. She helped shape Greek strategy, inspire resistance, and unite rival city-states against a common foe. In the darkest days of the Persian threat, Delphis' voice rang out as both warning and rallying cry. Athens and Delphi shared a relationship woven from both devotion and political necessity. The Athenians were among the most frequent petitioners to the oracle, turning to Apollo's voice in times of war, diplomacy, and civic reform. Over the centuries, this bond shaped the destiny of the city as much as the wisdom of its own leaders. One of the earliest and most celebrated interactions came during the reforms of Solon. In the 6th century BCE, Athens was riven by debt, inequality, and political unrest. Solon, chosen as archon, sought divine guidance before enacting his sweeping laws. At Delphi, the Pythia hailed him as the friend of the people and of the law, assuring him that Apollo blessed his mission. This gave Solon the moral authority to cancel debts, reform the courts, and lay the groundwork for Athenian democracy. Later, in the Persian Wars, the oracle's relationship with Athens became crucial. The famous wooden wall prophecy, delivered before the Battle of Salamis, was the hinge upon which Athens' survival turned. Themistocles' interpretation, that it referred to their navy, led the city to abandon the Acropolis and meet the Persians at sea. The victory that followed elevated Athens to the leadership of the Greek world. But Delphis' guidance was not always comforting. Before the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the Pythia reportedly warned the Athenians to avoid conflict. The warning went unheeded, and the war ended in disaster for Athens. Some accused the oracle of favoring Sparta, while others saw it as a sign that the gods' counsel had been ignored at their peril. The Athenians also consulted the oracle on matters beyond warfare. During the plague that struck Athens in Centius BCE, killing thousands, including their leader Pericles, delegations went to Delphi seeking relief. The Pythia advised purification rituals and the dedication of offerings to Apollo, but the disease ran its course, leaving the city shaken and questioning the limits of divine intervention. Despite moments of tension, Athens continued to honor Delphi. The city contributed to the upkeep of the sanctuary, sent lavish gifts, and often displayed its victories there. The Athenian treasury, built after the Battle of Marathon, was both an offering and a monument to their enduring alliance with Apollo. In the 6th century BCE, as Athens faced the rise of Macedon under Philip II, the oracle's role became. While some Athenians suspected Delphi of being influenced by Macedonian power, others still sought her wisdom, believing that Apollo's voice rose above mortal politics. Through triumphs and tragedies, Athens remained a constant presence at Delphi. For the Athenians, The oracle was not merely a religious authority, she was a mirror, reflecting both their ambitions and their flaws, and a reminder that even the greatest city needed the counsel of the gods. If Athens came to Delphi with questions of strategy, democracy, and empire, Sparta's visits were bound to the steel discipline and martial destiny of the warrior state. For centuries, the Spartans treated the oracle as an extension of their own code. Direct, unyielding, and grounded in the belief that fate was to be met with courage. According to tradition, the very structure of Sparta's laws came from Delphi. The legendary lawgiver Lycurgus traveled to the sanctuary, seeking guidance on how to craft a just and powerful state. The Pythia proclaimed him beloved of the gods and declared his laws divine. With this sacred approval, Lycurgus instituted the rigid Spartan constitution, its dual kingship, and its military-focused education system, the agoge. From that day, Spartan law held the force of both human and divine authority. The oracle's voice often echoed in Sparta's military decisions. Before major campaigns, kings and generals would seek Apollo's blessing. The most famous example came in Bashar's BCE, when the Persians threatened Greece. The Pythia told Sparta that either their city would be destroyed or a king of Heraclid blood must die. King Leonidas took the prophecy as a personal summons to sacrifice himself at Thermopylae. His stand with Samnite Spartans became legendary, not as a victory, but as a fulfillment of destiny. The oracle also intervened in matters of alliance and diplomacy. Before the First Peloponnesian War, she advised Sparta to be cautious of extending its influence too far. The Spartans listened until Athens' growing power forced their hand. During the later Peloponnesian War, some accused the Pythia of favoring Sparta, as several of her prophecies warned Athens to restrain itself. Whether this was divine will or political influence remains debated, but it did little to harm the bond between Delphi and Sparta. Not all oracles were straightforward blessings. In one instance, the Pythia warned the Spartans that their walls were of men, not of stone, reminding them that their safety lay in the discipline and courage of their warriors, rather than fortifications. This was a truth they embraced with pride. In peacetime, Sparta still honored the sanctuary. They sent rich offerings after victories, dedicated statues of their kings, and ensured their young warriors learned the tales of Apollo and the Pythia's guidance. Even their famed brevity of speech echoed the oracle's style, short, sharp, and powerful. The Spartans never forgot that the god's voice could cut both ways, granting glory or sealing doom. To them, Delphi was not a place to bargain with fate, but to receive it with open eyes and a steady heart. And so, through centuries of war and uneasy peace, Sparta remained among Apollo's most loyal and formidable petitioners. In a world where most positions of authority were held by men, the Oracle of Delphi was an extraordinary exception. At the heart of the sanctuary stood a woman, the Pythia, whose words could guide kings, shape wars, and decide the fate of entire nations. Her authority was unmatched, and her voice carried further than that of any queen or political leader of her age. The choice of the Pythia was deliberate and symbolic. She was always a woman past the age of youth, chosen from the local population of Delphi. Tradition claims she should be of pure life and high reputation, though her social rank could vary from humble farmer's daughter to the widow of a respected citizen. Once chosen, she left behind her old life, taking up a sacred role as the mouthpiece of Apollo. Her position elevated her above the typical limits placed on women in Greek society. While other women were confined largely to domestic life, the Pythia met with kings, generals, and ambassadors. They listened to her words with reverence, accepting them as the will of the god. In the Adyton, the boundaries of gender dissolved. She spoke not as a woman, but as a vessel of divine truth. Telephus' influence on women extended beyond the Pythia herself. Myths told of female petitioners whose destinies were changed by the oracle's counsel. A noblewoman might consult Apollo before arranging her daughter's marriage, seeking a match that would ensure prosperity and alliance. A grieving mother might ask about a son lost in battle. The god's answers could comfort, warn, or inspire action. Pray. The sanctuary also honored female deities alongside Apollo. Before his worship began, Delphi had been a center for Gaia, the earth goddess, and Themis, goddess of justice and divine order. Even in Apollo's time, Athena had her own shrine, the Tholos of Athena Pronaia, where women could offer prayers for wisdom and safe childbirth. There were stories, too, of women who defied expectation through the oracle's words. One tale speaks of a widow who sought the Pythia's guidance after her husband's death left her landless. So, the prophecy advised her to plant roots where the eagle rests. She followed the omen to a high hill, built a home, and began a farm that would feed her descendants for generations. The Pythia's own life, however, was marked by both privilege and isolation. She lived under the care of the temple, bound by strict purity laws. When her term as oracle ended, whether by choice, age, or failing strength, she returned to private life, but her name was remembered with honor. In a society where women's voices were rarely heard in public affairs, Delphis' oracle stood as living proof that wisdom, authority, and divine inspiration could transcend the boundaries of gender. Through her, the god's voice spoke not only to men but to all humanity. Both core, at the heart of the temple of Apollo sat a mysterious stone, unlike any other in Greece, the omphalos, or navel of the world. Smooth, rounded, and covered in an intricate net-like pattern of carved relief, it was bound with sacred woolen fillets and kept beside the Pythia's tripod. For the Greeks, this was not just a relic, it was the literal center of the earth. The myth of the omphalos began with Zeus, king of the gods. To determine the earth's center, he released two eagles from opposite ends of the world, one from the east, one from the west. Their flight paths crossed high above the slopes of Mount Parnassus, marking Delphi as the world's middle point. Here, Zeus placed the stone, declaring it the earth's navel, a place where heaven and earth were joined. To stand before the omphalos was to stand at the axis of the cosmos. Pilgrims believed that the stone connected the mortal realm to the divine, allowing Apollo's voice to reach humanity through the Pythia. The location was no accident. Beneath Delphis' soil lay ancient sanctity, a site once sacred to Gaia before Apollo claimed it as his own. The stone itself was an object of deep symbolism. Its rounded shape evoked both the human navel, a symbol of life's origin, and the egg and cosmic unity. The crisscrossing patterns carved into its surface resembled the woven net of fate, binding all living things together. For philosophers, the omphalos was not just a mythic marker, but a reminder of the interconnectedness of all existence. Ancient sources suggest that there were actually two omphalos stones. One stood in the open air as a public monument, allowing pilgrims to touch it, pray before it, and leave offerings. The other, kept in the Adyton beside the Pythia, was a sacred object never to be handled except during rituals. Both were venerated, but the one inside the temple was seen as the true center, the very one placed by Zeus. Throughout Greek history, the omphalos served as a symbol of unity. In times of political tension, city-states would send envoys to Delphi, declaring that all Greece shared this sacred center. Even foreign rulers, from Egypt to the Near East, sent gifts to honor it. When Rome rose to power, the omphalos fascinated its emperors. Coins were minted bearing its image, ensuring that the symbol of Delphi's cosmic centrality traveled across the empire. Even as political control shifted, the belief in Delphi as a bridge between worlds endured. Today, the omphalos remains one of the most iconic symbols of ancient Greece, a silent stone that once marked the heartbeat of the world, where gods and mortals met, and where every road of prophecy began and ended. Long before a petitioner stood before the Pythia, they would encounter the timeless wisdom of Delphi, carved directly into the stone of the pronaos. The forecourt of the Temple of Apollo. These short, sharp moral commands were known as the Delphic Maxims, a collection of sayings that embodied the values of Greek life and the philosophy of Apollo's sanctuary. The most famous of these maxims were only 3 words long, yet they carried the weight of centuries. Know thyself, gnothi soton, and nothing in excess. Maiden, agen. These phrases were placed prominently on the temple's entrance, a reminder that those who sought divine guidance must first understand their own nature and avoid the ruin brought by hubris. Legend held that these inscriptions were not the work of a single author, but a gift from the 7 sages of Greece. Wise men such as Solon of Athens, Chilon of Sparta, and Bias of Priene. They offered their wisdom to Apollo's temple, ensuring that every visitor, from humble farmer to mighty king, received moral counsel before even speaking a question. Beyond the famous 2, ancient writers recorded as many as deeds.This Delphic maxims, covering all aspects of life. Respect your elders, control your anger, help your friends, fear the gods, honor your parents. These were not merely rules, they were reminders of the balance, order, and self-control that Apollo represented. For the Greeks, the maxims were as binding as any law. A man who ignored them risked not only social disgrace, but also divine disfavor. To live in accordance with them was to live in harmony with the gods' will. And in a world where fate was seen as inevitable, the maxims offered a path toward living well within the boundaries the gods had set. Philosophers often reflected on these sayings. Socrates' interpretation of know thyself was that wisdom began with the recognition of one's ignorance. For others, it meant understanding one's strengths and weaknesses before taking action. Nothing in excess was understood not as a denial of pleasure, but as a call to moderation, a way to avoid the self-destruction brought by greed, pride, or passion. The maxims were more than temple decoration. They were woven into the rituals of the sanctuary. Priests would sometimes recite them to petitioners before they entered the inner temple. Victors of the Pythian Games might dedicate their wreaths beneath them. Even foreign visitors carried the words home, spreading Delphis' influence far beyond Greece. In the quiet moments before meeting the Pythia, a petitioner might stand before these inscriptions, reading them over and over, letting their meaning sink in. Perhaps they realized that Apollo's greatest gift was not the answer to their question, but the wisdom to ask it well. For centuries, Delphi had been the unquestioned voice of the gods, its oracle sought by kings, philosophers, and commoners alike. Yet no empire, no sanctuary, no human institution stands untouched by time. By the late Hellenistic period, subtle changes began to erode the absolute authority of the Pythia, setting in motion a decline that would take centuries to complete. One cause was political. As the great Greek city-states fell to the rising power of Macedonia under Philip II and Alexander the Great, the center of political life shifted. Decisions that once required Delphis counsel were now made by monarchs whose ambitions spanned continents. While Alexander himself visited the oracle, his campaigns far from Greece lessened the sanctuary's centrality to political affairs. Economic changes also played a role. The wealth that had once poured into the treasuries along the sacred way slowed as wars drained resources. Rival religious centers began to flourish, drawing pilgrims and gifts away from Delphi. Sanctuaries dedicated to Isis, Serapis, and other foreign gods grew in popularity, reflecting the increasingly cosmopolitan world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Even the oracle's reliability came under question. Skeptics pointed out that the Pythia's answers were often vague, open to multiple interpretations, and sometimes contradictory. The rise of philosophical schools like Stoicism and Epicureanism encouraged people to look inward for guidance rather than to the gods. Natural forces added to the earthquakes in the 3rd and 3rd centuries BCE damaged parts of the sanctuary, including the Temple of Apollo itself. While the Delphians rebuilt, each disaster chipped away at the sense of divine invincibility that had surrounded the site for generations. There were still moments of glory. Foreign rulers, including the kings of Pergamon and Rome, sent gifts to honor Apollo, but these visits often had more to do with political symbolism than genuine faith in the oracle's power. Increasingly, prophecies were sought for ceremonial purposes, to legitimize a ruler's reign, rather than to make truly life-altering decisions. Internally, the role of the Pythia began to change. Where once she had been chosen from the Delphian citizenry and served for life, now the position sometimes rotated among several women, with fewer sessions held each year. The deep, mystical preparation of earlier centuries gave way to a more formalized, almost theatrical ritual. Despite these shifts, Delphi remained a place of beauty and reverence. Pilgrims still climbed the sacred way, still bathed in the Castalian spring, and still gazed in awe at the Omphalos stone, Jordan Pierce, Testutions. Yet an unspoken truth lingered in the mountain air. The days when the oracle could shape the destiny of all Greece were fading. The gods still spoke, but fewer listened with the same urgency as before. When the legions of Rome swept across the Mediterranean, Delphi, like the rest of Greece, found itself under a new and vastly different power. The sanctuary that had once guided kings and city-states now served emperors and governors whose reach extended far beyond the Greek world. Yet rather than fall into obscurity, Delphi adapted, reshaping its role within the Roman Empire. The Romans, inheritors of Greek culture, held deep respect for the oracle of Apollo. Statesmen, generals, and even emperors visited the sanctuary, not only to seek divine counsel, but also to align themselves with the prestige of the ancient Greek world. For them, Delphi was a living relic of a glorious past, a bridge connecting their rule to the age of myth and heroism. One of the most famous imperial visitors was Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE. A lover of Greek culture, Hadrian endowed the sanctuary with funds for repairs, sponsored games, and added new buildings. His visit revitalized Delphi's status for a time, drawing pilgrims from across the empire. Under his patronage, the Pythian Games expanded in scope, featuring athletes and artists from as far away as Egypt and Gaul. Other emperors also sought the oracle's counsel. Nero, while touring Greece, consulted the Pythia, though he was famously unpredictable in his treatment of sacred traditions, at one point removing hundreds of statues from Greek temples to adorn Rome. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher emperor, came to Delphi not for military advice but for moral and philosophical reflection, demonstrating that the oracle's appeal still extended beyond politics. The sanctuary itself changed under Roman influence. Latin inscriptions appeared alongside Greek, and dedications from distant provinces filled the sacred way. Roman architectural styles merged with the traditional Greek structures, giving Delphi a subtly different appearance while maintaining its core identity. However, not all Roman involvement was beneficial. As political power centralized in Rome, Delphi's role in governance diminished. The oracle's prophecies were still sought, but often for ceremonial affirmation rather than decisive strategic guidance. The spiritual weight of Apollo's voice was being transformed into a symbol of cultural heritage. Religious shifts within the empire also began to challenge Delphos' influence. Orishif, the rise of Eastern mystery cults, and, later, the spread of Christianity drew attention away from traditional Greek sanctuaries. While Apollo's voice still echoed from the Adyton, it now competed with new gods and new philosophies. Yet for all these changes, Delphi retained its aura. Roman senators still walked the sacred way. Poets still invoked the Pythia in their verses, and pilgrims still believed that here, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the gods could speak to mortals. Under Delphi was no longer the political heart of the Greek world, but it remained a beating heart of memory, tradition, and sacred pursuit. In the late Esont and early 2nd centuries CE, one of Delphos' most famous residents was not a Pythia or a king, but a philosopher, Plutarch. Born in the nearby town of Cheronea, Plutarch was a devoted scholar, priest of Apollo, and one of the greatest biographers and moralists of antiquity. His writings offer a rare, intimate window into the workings of the oracle during the Roman era. Plutarch's life at Delphi was a blend of ritual duty and philosophical contemplation. As a priest of Apollo, he oversaw ceremonies, guided pilgrims through purification rites, and helped preserve the traditions of the sanctuary. He also acted as a custodian of its history, ensuring that the myths, records, and sacred objects of Delphi were passed on to future generations. In his treatises, such as the Oracles at Delphi no longer given in verse and the obsolescence of oracles, Plutarch reflected on the changes he observed. He acknowledged that the oracle no longer held the political power it once had, and that the Pythia spoke less frequently than in the Golden Age. But rather than lament this entirely, he sought to understand it, interpreting the decline as part of the natural ebb and flow of divine communication. Plutarch defended the oracle's value against skeptics. He argued that the prophecies, even when obscure, served to sharpen the minds of those who received them, forcing them to think, interpret, and reflect on their own actions. For him, the oracle's purpose was not simply to reveal the future, but to encourage wisdom in the present. He also described the Pythia's trance with a mix of reverence and curiosity. While some in his time speculated that the vapors were a form of intoxication, Plutarch maintained that her inspiration came from a divine source, elevated by ritual purity and the sanctity of the site. His accounts suggest that, even in the Roman era, the moments of prophecy retained a profound and almost theatrical intensity. Plutarch's role as both philosopher and priest made him a bridge between two worlds, the ancient religious traditions of Greece and the increasingly philosophical, cosmopolitan culture of the Roman Empire. Through his works, he preserved not only the image of Delphis' past grandeur, but also the enduring spiritual and moral lessons it offered. Even after his death, Plutarch's writings ensured that the oracle's voice would not be forgotten. His words traveled far beyond the slopes of Mount Parnassus, inspiring readers from Byzantium to the Renaissance. In this way, Plutarch became, in his own fashion, an oracle of wisdom, his counsel echoing long after the god's voice began to fade. By the late Roman Empire, the voice of the Pythia had grown faint. The great lines of petitioners that once filled the sacred way now came only on rare festival days. Political leaders still visited Delphi, but more for tradition and prestige than for life-changing guidance. The oracle, though still revered, stood on the threshold of its final century. Several late prophecies from this period survive in ancient sources, their tone often tinged with resignation, as though Apollo himself sensed the coming end. One famous example dates to the reign of the Emperor Julian the Apostate. In the mid-6th century CE, a ruler who sought to restore the old pagan faiths in a Christianizing empire. When Julian sent envoys to Delphi, the Pythia reportedly replied, "Oh, tell the king, the fair-wrought hall has fallen. Phoebus has no shelter, nor sacred laurel. The speaking spring is silent. The voice of prophecy is stilled." It was a chilling admission, the god's own acknowledgment that his sanctuary was fading from the world. Some took it as a final farewell, others as a call to resist the tide of change. In these final years, the Pythia sessions were sporadic. The staff of priests had dwindled, and the once complex preparations for prophecy were often abbreviated. The laurel leaves, the water from the Castalian spring, and the incense still remained, but the great pageantry of earlier centuries had given way to simpler rites. Yet even in decline, the oracle retained flashes of its old power. Local leaders sometimes sought her advice on disputes or civic matters. Travelers from distant lands, more curious tourists than devout petitioners, were still awed by the temple's setting, the mountain cliffs, and the solemn figure of the Pythia seated upon her tripod. There were also whispers that some prophecies foretold the rise of the new faith spreading through the empire. One account claims the Pythia warned of a single god whose worship would overshadow all others. Whether authentic or a later Christian invention, such tales symbolized the passing of the old order. By the end of the 6th century, with Christianity declared the official religion of the Roman Empire and pagan temples increasingly closed or repurposed, the oracle sessions ceased. The adyton fell silent, the omphalos was removed or hidden, and the laurel groves went untended. To those who loved Delphi, the last prophecies were not a defeat but a transformation. They believed Apollo had simply withdrawn, his voice no longer needed in a world that had chosen another path. The god's presence, they said, still lingered in the mountain air, in the rush of the Castalian spring, and in the memories of all who had heard him speak. When the voice of the Pythia fell silent, Delphi began its slow descent from a living sanctuary into a relic of memory. The temple of Apollo, once filled with incense, music, and the murmurs of prophecy, stood empty under the bright, without the constant care of its priests and the offerings of pilgrims. The sanctuary's stone began to weather, its marble dulled by wind and rain. The closure of pagan temples, ordered by the Christian emperors in the late 6th and early 8th centuries, sealed Delphis' fate. Statues of the gods were removed or toppled, their gold and silver offerings confiscated or melted down. The sacred fires were extinguished, and the great bronze tripod of the Pythia was taken away. The Omphalos stone, once the center of the world, disappeared, hidden, destroyed, or perhaps carried off to adorn another shrine. Nature began reclaiming the site. Weeds grew between the paving stones of the sacred way. The laurel groves, no longer tended, grew wild. The Castalian spring still flowed, but its water now served only travelers and shepherds. The cries of birds replaced the chanting of priests, and the mountain winds carried silence, where once they had borne the god's voice. In time, earthquakes further damaged the sanctuary. Walls cracked, columns tumbled, and the roof of the Temple of Apollo collapsed in sections, leaving the inner chambers exposed to the elements. Floods and landslides from the steep slopes above carried debris into the ruins, burying statues and inscriptions beneath layers of earth. The people of Delphi adapted. Some of the marble blocks were reused to build houses, churches, and fortifications. A small Christian basilica rose near the old sanctuary, its altar standing, where once sacrifices had been made to Apollo. For the new faith, the ruins of the pagan past were both a warning and a quarry of ready-cut stone. Yet the site never completely lost its aura. Travelers still came, locals seeking shelter among the ruins during storms, merchants passing through, and, occasionally, pilgrims who could not forget the god's voice. They stood among the broken columns, touching the carved stones, imagining the days when kings had walked here in splendor. By the Middle Ages, Delphi had faded from maps and memory, its name surviving only in scattered manuscripts and whispered legends. The Temple of Apollo lay in silence, a shattered frame of marble and shadow, and yet, in the rustle of leaves by the Castalian spring, some claim they could still hear the faintest echo of prophecy, a reminder that even in ruin, the spirit of Delphi endured. By the late 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was changing. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had become the official religion under Emperor Theodosius I. In this new order, pagan temples were no longer merely relics of the past. They were viewed as rivals to the Christian faith. For Delphi, this meant the final and deliberate silencing of Apollo's voice. Imperial decrees forbade sacrifices to the old gods and outlawed divination. These laws were not abstract. They were enforced. Priests of Apollo were dismissed. The Pythias office was formally abolished, and the sanctuary's wealth was confiscated. The marble floors that had felt the footsteps of kings were soon trodden by imperial agents, carrying out orders of closure. The Temple of Apollo, already weakened by earthquakes and neglect, was stripped of its sacred objects. The great bronze tripod, the golden offerings of kings, and the ornate treasures from city-states were carried away. The Omphalos stone, symbol of the world's center, vanished, hidden or destroyed to prevent its veneration. The Adyton, once filled with incense and the Pythias voice, stood cold and empty. In Delphi's lower sanctuary, the Tholos of Athena Pronaea was also abandoned. Where once pilgrims had prayed to the goddess for protection, the building now lay silent. Christian preachers used its emptiness as a sermon against the false gods of the old religion, pointing to its stillness as proof that Apollo and his kind had no power left. Local conversion to Christianity was gradual but steady. The Castalian spring, once sacred to Apollo and the Muses, was rededicated to Christian saints. Ritual baths for purification before meeting the oracle gave way to baptisms in the name of the new faith. The old festivals, like the Pythian Games, were discontinued or replaced with Christian celebrations, yet not everyone welcomed the change. In remote mountain villages, whispers persisted that the gods still lingered in the winds of Parnassus. Some locals claimed to see faint lights in the ruins at night, or to hear echoes of chanting from the empty temple. These stories were quietly discouraged, for they clashed with the official narrative that Apollo had been defeated. A symbolic end to Delphis' spiritual reign came in the form of a prophecy, one of the very last, recorded in the reign of Emperor Theodosius. When asked about the future, the Pythia is said to have replied, "Tell the king, the hall has fallen. Phoebus no longer speaks. The spring has run dry. The laurel has withered." Whether these were truly her words or a Christian creation to mark the transition, they became the epitaph of the oracle. The voice that had guided Greece for nearly 1,000 years was silent, replaced by new prayers, new rituals, and a new god. For more than 1,000 years, the ruins of Delphi lay hidden beneath the soil of time. Villages grew over its sacred ground. Stones from its temples were repurposed for homes and churches, and the world forgot exactly where the center of the earth had once stood. Only scattered ancient writings, Herodotus, Pausanias, Plutarch, kept its memory alive. By the 7th century, scholars and explorers began to suspect that the legendary oracle could be found again. In the early Barbads, European travelers in Greece recorded seeing ancient columns, fragments of inscriptions, and carved stones in the mountain village of Castri, which occupied part of the ancient sanctuary site. The view of Mount Parnassus and the Phaedrids cliffs matched ancient descriptions, but without systematic excavation, the ruins' identity remained uncertain. Interest grew with the rise of classical archaeology. In Barbads, the French scholar François Pouqueville identified the location as Delphi based on topography and surviving inscriptions. Still, the remains lay mostly buried beneath the modern settlement, making large-scale excavation impossible until France and Greece struck an agreement decades later. In Barbads, the French archaeological school at Athens began the Great Excavation, a monumental project that required relocating the entire village of Castri to a new site nearby. Over the next several years, archaeologists unearthed a city frozen in time, the Sacred Way, the treasuries of the Athenians and Siphnians, the theater, the stadium, the tholos of Athena Pronaia, and, most importantly, the Temple of Apollo. The discoveries were astonishing. Fragments of the omphalos stone emerged from the soil, along with inscriptions of the Delphic maxims and dedications from kings and city-states. Sculptures, pottery, and thousands of coins told the story of Delphis' long history, from its archaic beginnings to its Roman twilight. One of the most celebrated finds was the Charioteer of Delphi, a life-sized bronze statue dating to BCE, miraculously preserved and still standing upright in the earth after more than 2 millennia. Its fine detail, from the folds of the chiton to the lifelike eyes, became an icon of ancient Greek art. As the excavation progressed, scholars pieced together the layout of the sanctuary as it had been in its prime. The Sacred Way once again wound its way upward, flanked by the restored treasuries. The theater, perched above the temple, regained its view of the valley and the Gulf of Corinth. Delphis' rediscovery captured the imagination of the world. Artists painted romantic visions of the ruins, writers wove it into their works, and historians marveled at the continuity between the site and the myths. Though Apollo's voice no longer echoed in the Adyton, the stones themselves spoke, whispering of prophecies, pilgrimages, and 1,000 years of history beneath the mountain's watchful cliffs. Today, Delphi is no longer a hidden ruin. It is one of the most visited archaeological sites in Greece, drawing travelers from every corner of the world. Though the voice of the Pythia has been silent for over 15 centuries, the stones still speak through their enduring beauty. their placement on the sacred slopes of Mount Parnassus, and the myths they carry. The sacred way still winds upward from the sanctuary's entrance, now lined not with gleaming treasures, but with carefully preserved ruins. Visitors follow in the footsteps of kings and pilgrims, passing the restored treasury of the Athenians, its white marble gleaming once more in the sunlight. Inscriptions on its walls, victories, dedications, and words of thanks to Apollo remain legible, connecting modern eyes to voices from the ancient world. Above, the Temple of Apollo stands in partial ruin, its tall columns reaching toward the sky. The foundations of the Adyton are visible, allowing visitors to imagine where the Omphalos once rested and where the Pythia once sat upon her tripod. Even without its roof, the temple's position commands a breathtaking view of the valley below, framed by the golden cliffs of the Phaedriades. To one side lies the theater, built into the slope of the mountain, where ancient audiences once watched performances and contests during the Pythian Games. From its stone seats, one can gaze down over the temple and sacred way, the same view spectators enjoyed more than 2,000 years ago. Higher still, the stadium awaits, its long track bordered by stone seating for thousands of spectators. Here, athletic competitions celebrated Apollo's honor, and the laurel wreaths of victory were bestowed. The stadium is one of the best preserved in Greece, a silent testament to the athletic spirit of the ancient world. Beyond the main sanctuary lies the Tholos of Athena Pronea, one of Delphis' most photographed monuments. Its graceful circular foundation, with 3 surviving Doric columns, rises against a backdrop of mountains and sky. This smaller sanctuary once greeted pilgrims before they entered Apollo's domain, offering a place of prayer and protection. The Archaeological Museum of Delphi houses treasures uncovered during the Great Excavation, including the bronze charioteer of Delphi, fragments of the Omphalos stone, and intricate friezes from the treasuries. Each artifact tells a part of the sanctuary's long and layered history. Modern Delphi blends past and present. The nearby village offers, with cafes and terraces, overlooking the valley of olive groves stretching to the Gulf of Corinth. Festivals, concerts, and lectures occasionally return music and poetry to the ancient theater, reviving echoes of the Pythian Games. For this, walking among the ruins today, one feels the weight of history and the pull of legend. The marble may be weathered, the gods long silent, but the spirit of Delphi, the idea that wisdom, art, and reverence for the divine can shape the fate of nations, remains as alive as it was in Apollo's time. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the heart of ancient Greece, where myth and history meet on the sacred slopes of Mount Parnassus. Together, we have walked the winding sacred way, stood before the gleaming columns of the Temple of Apollo, and listened to the mysterious voice of the Pythia, the oracle whose words shaped the fate of cities, kings, and empires. The story of Delphi is more than a tale of prophecy. It is a reflection on the timeless human desire to seek guidance, to understand our place in the world, and to hear the voice of something greater than ourselves. Even though the sanctuary has stood in silence for centuries, its legacy still whispers through its ruins. In the golden cliffs, the flowing Castalian spring, and the enduring wisdom of its maxims. As you leave this story, may you carry with you the lesson that the true oracle often lies within: the courage to ask the right questions, the humility to listen, and the wisdom to act with balance. From the center of the ancient world to wherever you are today, may Apollo's light guide your own path forward,